as to my time allotment and also the time for the next vote.
All time has now expired.
All right.
The question is on the McCafferty nomination.
And the question is on the McCafferty nomination.
Is there a sufficient second?
Yes,
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
We'll call the roll.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain.
We're going to vote again in a few minutes.
Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul.
There's something between 100 and 0, or unlimited and 0. And we've got to come in. And what I mean,
Mr. Portman.
no.
Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer.
Last week, he said, but it's lunchtime.
Card wants for yes. I'll vote for it.
Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow.
Aye.
Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Ayotte, Baldwin, Begich, Booker, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Chambliss, Coburn, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, Mikulski, Moran, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye.
No.
Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Barrasso, Blunt, Coates, Enzi, Fisher, Inhofe, Johans, McConnell, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Vitter. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Who are you missing? Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye.
Jeff Collins, I need Senator Collins.
Is anyone wishing to change their vote or to vote? If not, you're good.
Yeas are 79.
The yeas are 79, the nays are 19.
Nomination is confirmed.
Nomination is confirmed. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Patricia M. Wald of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, signed by 19 senators.
Pursuant to Rule 22, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
The quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Patricia M. Wald of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Baucus. Bennett.
Aye.
Mr. Carper. Mr. Coons. Portman. Mr. Levin.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Ms. Baldwin.
Either way is fine, probably, but we'll do it
He
after.
switched, so my brain...
Mr. Barrasso. Campbell. Green. Sure. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich.
You can do them first. I yield to my Republican colleagues. Thanks.
You got it, right?
Yeah, gotcha. Toomey. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt.
White House, aye.
Mr. Reno. Yes. Thank you. Murray. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown. Gotcha. Mr. Sanders? Thank you. Mr. Mikulski? Thank you. Yes, we do. Sir.
Yeah, I got it to make. No, it doesn't include it.
Nelson. Yes, it is. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Markey. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin.
How do you look better than I do?
Mr. Enzi. No, I do.
Oh, sure.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Leahy. Thanks. I got you. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch.
No.
Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Okay. Mr. Scott. King. Ms. Menendez. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. I did get you, sir. Sir. Sessions. Flight votes no.
I don't know, I haven't heard from her yet, but I have to actually wait.
Mr. Enzi. Just going to do it early. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landry, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Rita, Rhode Island, Mr. Rita, Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coburn, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. You're a no. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Wishing to vote or wishing to change the vote?
Are any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote or to vote? If not, the ayes are 57, the nays are 41. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, Patricia M. Wald of the District of Columbia, to be a member of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board.
Pursuant to the provisions of SRES 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be up to 8 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination, equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President.
Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I yield back the majority's time on this nomination.
Time is yielded back. The Senator from Ohio.
On the nomination.
Senators recognized.
Mr. President, I'm glad to have this opportunity to come to the floor of this great body and spend a few minutes talking about issues that are of great concern to the people of Ohio that I represent and to our country. We're facing a lot of challenges right now. Certainly health care costs are on the rise, as we've seen, but jobs are also hard to come by. And there's a middle-class squeeze going on out there where paychecks are down, health care costs are up. Belief in the American dream, as a result, is on the decline. And some say that for the first time since polling has begun, people think that future generations are not going to be as well off as we are. This is sad, and there are things we can and should do to address this. It starts by dealing with some of the gridlock here in Washington, actually, and getting some things done. And one of my concerns about what the majority has done in terms of taking away the rights of the minority to be heard on nominations is creating a very tough environment to break through that gridlock and get things done. I think about the judiciary. Today we're talking about a court judge who is up for a nomination, and the question is whether she is going to be confirmed or not. Right now, under the current rules that exist, Republicans have no voice, in essence, because there's 50 votes Democrats, and there are 55 Democrats can put up a judge and get the votes and put anybody through they want. Under the system that has prevailed in this body for decades and one that's consistent with the intention of the founders, you have to get 60 votes. In other words, that the minority would have some voice, and specifically Republicans, and that there are 45 of us would have to supply about 5 votes. That makes a big difference in terms of the kinds of judges who are nominated and who ultimately are confirmed. So there's a lot of discussion about what's going on here on the floor in terms of ending the ability of the minority to have their voice heard. I think we also need to focus a little on what impact will this have on the judiciary. Recall, these are lifetime appointments. So when someone's appointed to the D.C. Circuit Court, somebody was recently confirmed, I think yesterday and the day before for that body. These are lifetime appointments. And instead of having to go through a process where you've got to figure out at least how to get some members of the other party to support you, right now, under the new rules that were done by breaking the rules, and again, inconsistent with the intent of the founders to have the minority allow their voice to be heard, you don't need to get 60 votes. You can do it with just 50. And again, with 55 Democrats, there's no need to consult with Republicans or to get any support. In fact, you can allow 5 Democrats to vote the other way. I worry that this will polarize the judiciary. I think we're polarized enough in this place. I think Washington is becoming dysfunctional for a lot of reasons, but one is this increased polarization. And now to have this rule change here not only creates a difficult environment to get work done here, but again, it also will be putting on the judiciary with lifetime appointments judges who, frankly, are more liberal under the Democrats and more conservative under the Republicans than they would otherwise be. In our states, particularly in states like mine where you have a Republican senator and a Democrat senator, we work together to try to put some judges forward. Frankly, Democrats realize in the majority that they have now, they have to get some Republican support, so they work with us. And you tend to get center-left judges right now nominated and confirmed. Again, under these new rules that Leader Reid and the Democrats have insisted on, that won't be required. Why would you have to consult with and work with your Republican counterpart in your state or Republicans on the other side of the chamber? Because with the mere 50 votes, you can put forward any judge that you want. And I do think this will result in judges who are not center-left but left, who are not center-right but right. I do think that will polarize the judiciary more, and this concerns me. So I hope, as we're thinking about how we deal with our own procedures here, and I know this is an issue that, again, has been debated a lot in the last few weeks because of the decision that the leadership made here, the Democrat leadership, to take away this right. I hope we're also thinking about what is the impact on our constituents? What is the impact, in this case, on the judiciary? Do we want to have a more polarized judiciary where some of these ideological differences make it difficult for them to operate just as it makes it difficult for the United States Congress to operate? I don't think so. I don't think that's what American people want. I know it's not what the founders intended when they gave the minority a voice in this body, and I do hope that we can get back to a regular order where, yeah, we have a limitation on amendments that is reasonable, reasonable time limits. That's true. We need to get our work done. But let's allow amendments to be offered. Let's allow the voices to be heard. Let's allow, in case of these nominations, to have some input from the other side. I'm very concerned about where this is headed. The logical extension of what the Democrats have done, of course, would be to extend this to legislation as well, which I, again, think creates even more of a problem than we have already in terms of legislation being passed here that is not reflective of the will of the people, that is not subject to the kind of checks and balances that we would have under a rule where you have to get 60, not 50 votes to be able to pass legislation. A prime example would be Obamacare. Let's be honest. The reason it got through the United States Senate was because a special provision was used called reconciliation, which is supposed to be for budget matters, revenues and spending. I believe that that was an inappropriate use of reconciliation. So do many other observers who are objective observers who have followed this place for a long time. And Obamacare was pushed through, not with 60 votes, because after the election of Scott Brown in Massachusetts a few years ago, they didn't have 60 votes to get Obamacare done because not a single Republican would support it, because Republicans supported an alternative plan. So without a single Republican supporting it, Democrats chose to ram it through with 50 votes. That's all they needed, because they used this so-called reconciliation provision that, again, is supposed to be for budget issues, not for health care. I think the results are now plain to see. We have law in place that is affecting my constituents, affecting the constituents of every senator in here, that has very negative consequences. Did we need to do something to reform the health care system? Absolutely. Was the status quo acceptable? No. Is it acceptable now? Absolutely not. But there are smart reforms to reduce costs, smart reforms to add more choice, to allow markets to work better in health care, to not only provide for better quality and better choice, but also lower costs. Those were not pursued. And we still have the opportunity now to do that. I talked earlier about the fact that health care is a big concern to the American people right now. It certainly is among my constituents in Ohio. We do a teletown hall meeting periodically. So we had a couple of them last month where I'll get maybe 25,000 Ohioans on the phone at any one time and talk to them about the issues of the day and hear their questions and concerns. And during those teletown hall meetings, we ask a poll question. We say, you know, what's the most important issue that you think is facing the country? And we ask about whether it's national security and terrorism, whether it's energy policy and costs at the pump, or whether it's their health care and health care costs, or whether it's jobs in the economy, or some other issue. And it's interesting, every single teletown hall I've had over the past few years, it's always been that jobs in the economy is the #1 issue. That these, again, there may be 25,000 people on any one time, or thousands of people on when we ask the poll question. That's been the #1 issue. Usually the #2 issue is debt and deficit and spending. The last two teletown halls we did last month, guess what the #1 issue was? It wasn't jobs in the economy. It wasn't debt and deficit. It was health care. And it was health care because people are so concerned about what Obamacare is doing to them and to their families. I want to let them speak for themselves. Some of us were out here on the floor a couple weeks ago talking about this, but since that time I've received a whole lot of stories from people I represent. Here's one from Susan from Batavia, which is in Claremont County in southern Ohio. Susan says, I'm a single mom. I pay for my own health insurance. I'm active and fit. I've cycled over 4,000 miles this year. Good for you. I'm seldom sick. In the 3 years I've paid for my own insurance, I went to the doctor once for illness. My rate was $146 a month. In September, I received a letter from Anthem saying my plan does not meet the requirements of the Affordable Care Act and will be discontinued as of January 1st, 2014. I was offered the same coverage I had, not for $146 a month, but for $350 a month. So to Susan from Batavia, thanks for your story. Thanks for letting us know what's really happening, how this is actually affecting you as a single mom who's taking care of herself, trying to do the right things, had a plan that she thought worked for her, was told, nope, government knows best. Top-down Washington, we know best. You can't have your plan. Here's the plan you have to have comparable coverage. We're going to raise your rates by over double. Here's Mike from Westlake in Northeast Ohio. Mike writes, he says, I own a small business. Our health insurance rates for single employees under 30 went from $198 per month last year to $650 per month this year. That's a 260% increase thanks to Obamacare. This bill is going to put small businesses out of business. Here's one from William from Columbus, Ohio. We were paying $540 per month, but received a letter from Anthem stating that the rates would increase to $662 per month beginning September 2013, and then $1,114 per month in September 2014 as a result of the requirements per Obamacare. If that wasn't bad enough, our family doctor of 25 years informed us that he will end his practice on January 1st, 2014. Reason being, the government requirements of Obamacare, he said, made it just too difficult to continue. That's William from Columbus talking about an issue of price, obviously, going from $540 per month to $1,014 per month, but also about choice, that his doctor is stepping out because of Obamacare. Rachel from Northeast Ohio. Rachel says, My family and I own a small business. We were notified that our current health care plan is substandard at $860 per month. To comply, we now must pay $1,880 a month. This is beyond outrageous. That's what Rachel says. I agree with her. $860 a month to $880 per month, more than double, in order for her to have health care as a small business owner with she and her husband. John from Dublin, outside Columbus, we currently have a high deductible plan through Anthem and pay $330 per month. We're happy with our plan. It provides wellness visits for free, which is what we really need, and then catastrophic coverage in case something happens. When I reviewed our coverage and tried to renew it, I asked what an equivalent plan would cost under the exchange. The quote I received was $833 per month. Remember, he was paying $331 per month. Liked his plan. It provided wellness visits. It had a catastrophic in case he got in trouble. It goes from $331 to $833, back to his letter. And the deductible even went up from $11,000 to $12,700. So this notion that people have to get out of these plans because their deductibles are too high, the one that's acceptable based on Obamacare and this top-down approach is now a higher deductible. John says, my family simply cannot afford this plan. Here's Rachel. Here's Sarah from Raymond, Ohio. So Sarah writes, and these are painful. These are painful. But Sarah writes, I am literally crying right now because of our insurance. My family's new monthly cost, starting January 1st, is $323.82 biweekly and $647.64 a month, a difference of $420 from what we currently pay, and the new plan offers less with more out-of-pocket expenses. The ACA has failed, and it is hurting my family, not helping. Here's Chuck from Westchester. I tried to give this health care thing the benefit of the doubt. I went to the website, and all the estimates are more expensive than my canceled policy. My canceled policy was not only cheaper, it was better, and I don't qualify for any subsidies. Do I have any choice besides paying more money? Chuck, I'm not probably qualified to give you advice, but I will anyway. Your choice is to pay a penalty or pay more. That's what the government's telling you. That's what Obamacare is telling you. Cynthia from Canton, Ohio. I'm a substitute teacher. Recently, I received notice that I was not getting jobs every day like I have been for most of the past 13 years. I'm a good, dependable sub and work for $70 a day before taxes. I contacted the school system and was told that they are watching any sub to prevent over 30 hours a week because of the Affordable Care Act. Now, Cynthia's letter to me, unfortunately, is something that I'm hearing all over the state of Ohio, which is people are being told, you know what, we need to keep you under 30 hours. She's finding out as a substitute teacher in Canton, Ohio, that she can't get the job she used to get because they're telling her they want to watch the subs to prevent anybody getting more than 30 hours a week because of the Affordable Care Act. You probably know this, but under the Affordable Care Act, if you work over 30 hours a week, you're considered full-time, and therefore the company has to provide you with the health care insurance that, again, this top-down approach insists on, not the health care insurance that you may want or your employer may think is appropriate, but the health care insurance that the Affordable Care Act thinks is appropriate. So companies are telling folks, as in the case of this substitute teacher, private and public sector, you know what, we need to keep you under 30 hours because we simply can't afford that kind of health care. Here's Mark from Urbana, Ohio, in Champaign County. My wife and I are farmers. We have our own private health insurance plan, which is not cheap. We just learned that our insurer is canceling our plan and that the Obamacare plan will double our premiums to more than $1,000 per month. My wife is 55 years old. We do not need maternity coverage or free birth control or so much other coverage mandated by Obamacare. We are modest, middle-income people. What we need in this country is a policy to make health care more affordable. We can do this if we let Americans determine their own health care needs and shop for the best and most affordable care. Why not medical savings accounts for everyone? They would be privately owned so that no one is chained to their employer-sponsored plan. Why not require that health care providers post prices of their services? We can come up with much better alternatives to Obamacare. Please help us, Mark says. I agree with him. We can come up with much better alternatives, including letting people save more for their own health care. Why should we want to discourage that? In Obamacare, by the way, those of you who don't know this, those HSAs, the health savings accounts that this guy Mark's talking about that he'd like to see for everyone, those are made less attractive because they take away some of the health care tax benefit. So we're moving the wrong way. We're moving away from people taking care of their own health needs, encouraging them, again, to focus on wellness and prevention, understanding that it's their dollar that's at stake, and allowing them to build up a little nest egg if they are healthy and if they are able to avoid a health problem. And if they have a problem, they've got coverage. A high deductible, they've got coverage to take care of them. People should be able to make that decision on their own if that's what's best for them and their family. Here's Brian from Mentor. My family's Aetna plan is being canceled due to Obamacare. My old plan was $454 per month with a $5,000 per person deductible. The same deductible policy to buy a new plan is $1,038 per month. Again, more than double for Brian. Dean from Sandusky. Ever since I left my job in 2009, ever since I lost my job in 2009, I have been purchasing my own health care insurance. Last month, I received a letter in the mail stating that my plan is being canceled due to the ACA. I was told to look at plans on the exchange, which I did, and found a comparable plan that is over twice the cost of what I now have. In addition, this is over half of my monthly pension. I simply cannot afford this. I've always been a responsible, hardworking, self-dependent person. Now, due to the actions of our government, for the first time in my life, I will not have health care coverage. I'm 59 years old now, and I need this coverage. I'm outraged, to say the least. How can our government do this to us? I will remember this come election time. That's Dean from Sandusky. Lost his job, picked up a plan in the individual market that worked for him. He's now told it doesn't work. He's now going to have to pay twice. He can't afford it. It's not covered. He's on a fixed income. It sounds like he's going to go without coverage. And by the way, new polling data has come out showing that a lot of young people are going to go without coverage. One number is 38 or 28% of them are. Another number is closer to half. I don't know how many, but I'll tell you, a lot of young people I talk to are saying, you know what, I'd rather pay the penalty or take the risk than be covered. That's a problem for them, but it's also a problem for the Affordable Care Act because it is based on those people coming into the system and, frankly, providing the ability for others to get coverage under the risk pools that are set up under Obamacare. So the stories that I've told you are real people facing real problems. And they are problems that Washington created for them and their families. They were fine with their coverage. They liked their coverage. Now, I know my colleagues on this side of the aisle have their own stories about how people are getting coverage who didn't have it, particularly those with pre-existing conditions. I understand that. But these stories really obscure the question we should be debating on the floor. I agree we should cover people with pre-existing conditions. So do most Republicans. The question is, how do you do it? So when Democrats come to the floor and tell me, Rob, yeah, you've got all these stories of people who cannot afford health care insurance anymore and having a real hard time who are in the individual market, but we'll give you our stories of the folks with pre-existing conditions. My answer to that is, you know what? I also believe we ought to cover people with pre-existing conditions. I don't dispute that. We want to get coverage for more Americans. That's not the question we're debating. The question is whether Obamacare, with its mandates, its top-down centralized control, is the way to accomplish those goals. If the President, my friends on the other side of the aisle, believe the only way to increase coverage is to make everyone pay more, to force millions of Americans to give up their insurance, to make people lose their doctors, then they should say that's what their plan is, because that's what's happening. A lack of honesty and transparency, in my view, is one of the great failures of the Affordable Care Act. I believe Obamacare was sold to the American people on false pretenses. President Obama said, famously now, if you like your health care, you can keep it. In fact, I think he said, if you like your health care, you can keep it, period. But the one thing he could not do then was keep his word. He had to have known it then. All the information coming out indicates that that was knowledge that he should have had, and yet he kept saying it. So what began as a broken website and cancellation notices has turned into sticker shock for millions of Americans who are seeing their health care costs soar under Obamacare. But by the way, as I said earlier, these rising costs are not a mistake in Obamacare. They were intended in Obamacare. Under Obamacare, millions of Americans have to pay more for insurance in order for the program to work. The website can be fixed. And I assume it will be at some point, although they're certainly having a tough time with it. But this basic premise that it's at the heart of Obamacare, that other people's costs have to go up, and go up pretty dramatically, cannot be fixed. And the reason goes back to a critical choice that was made at the beginning of the health care reform debate. There are different approaches to covering the uninsured, to covering those with pre-existing conditions. The approach favored by Republicans, at least many Republicans, including me, would create real economic incentives to bring the uninsured into covered access to health care while taking critical steps to reduce the costs of health care. Number one reason people aren't covered? Cost. The best way to lower the number of uninsured, of course, is to make it easier and less expensive for people to get insurance in the first place. The President chose to take a very different approach, not to focus on the costs, which have gone up, not to focus on providing incentives for more people to get coverage, but instead a top-down, centralized approach. He turned to mandates. Obamacare requires that all Americans purchase insurance. It mandates what type of coverage that insurance includes, and it requires that private insurers accept all comers. Again, we all want to ensure that those with chronic conditions receive health care, but it also changes the way health care insurance underwriting works. Normally, insurance works by pooling resources for some future harm. So for those that have pre-existing condition, obviously the harm is already present, and their premiums are not going to be able to pay for their care for the most part. This is why these high-risk pools in states are something I support and others support, providing tax incentives for that. But the President needed a pool of cash to offset these often astronomical costs. That's how Obamacare was designed. So this notion that, gosh, costs are going up, we didn't intend that, of course they intended it. It's exactly the way they intended it. Obamacare needed more money than those policies would provide, so these plans, these private plans we've talked about earlier, people in the individual market had, many of which are high-deductible, low-cost, catastrophic plans. Many of the people who have these plans are young people who are relatively healthy. These folks were forced to buy insurance they didn't need because Obamacare needed the money. The plans that they had met the needs of those people, met the customers' needs, but frankly it didn't meet the government's needs. So those plans were regulated out of existence, padded with extra benefits and consumer protections that many of those who chose those policies didn't want, as Mark said from Urbana, and will never use. Sometimes these new policies, as we said, are double, sometimes they're triple. We've heard cases where they're 5, 10 times more. But what we've seen in the individual market is only the beginning. Next year, these same mandates and government overreach is going to move beyond the individual market and is coming into effect for where the vast majority of us get our health care, which is through our employer. So at some point, 80 million Americans will likely see their insurance plans canceled, we're told, and replaced by policies that cost more than they're currently paying. When the employer-based market comes under the Obamacare mandates, which, as you recall, is going to happen about a year from now because it was put off for a year. That was a delay that the President put in effect. We're going to see much, much more of this. And again, there is a better way. There's a way to put this partisanship behind us and do this together. We talked earlier about the fact that when you cram something through with all votes on one side of the aisle and ignore the other, you tend to get a policy that doesn't work for the American people. That's exactly what we've seen here. There is a better way, and we need to still pursue that better way. Instead of having fewer choices and higher costs for all Americans, there's a way to put together a plan that actually makes sense for the American people. This is something that Republicans and Democrats alike need to focus on. Instead of a top-down, centralized, government-knows-best solution, we need to go to solutions that actually reduce the cost of health care and provide more choice in health care. And it can be done. Obamacare should be repealed and replaced, in my view, but it should be replaced. Status quo is not acceptable. And I think the failures of Obamacare point the way as to what we should do. Reduce the costs. There are steps we could take today. For instance, remove the shackles of government regulation from the market. Let health care insurance and health care be less expensive. Let health care insurance be sold across state lines. That's something you can do with federal legislation. That will provide more competition. It'll lower the cost. There are some areas of my state where there's only a couple plans. I'm told under Obamacare in some states there's only a couple plans. You want to have more competition, not less. We should give people the ability to get health care on their own. We talked about health savings accounts. We should help create a healthy, vibrant individual health care market by giving people a tax incentive to purchase insurance, comparable to incentives that they would receive with employer-provided coverage, where there now is tax incentives to provide health care coverage. And let's deal with these frivolous lawsuits. That reduces the cost. So I appreciate the fact that one of my colleagues has joined me on the floor and is going to continue this discussion, but I want to go back to where we started. It doesn't have to be this way. What we're doing here in the United States Senate by taking away the rights of the minority is not going to help us with regard to getting better judges. It didn't help us in terms of cramming Obamacare through with 51 votes rather than the normal 60 that should have been required. It doesn't help for us to now continue down this track of a government one-size-fits-all approach to health care. We've heard the stories. We see what's happening. And we haven't even hit most Americans yet because they get their coverage from their employer. Instead, let's work together. Let's provide more choice. Let's reduce the cost. Let's ensure that everybody has access to health care that works for them and their families. If we do that, the American people might regain a little bit of trust in this institution and in this town. Madam President, I'd like to yield the floor, if I could, to my colleague and your colleague from North Dakota.
Madam President,
Senator from North Dakota.
I'd like to thank the esteemed senator from Ohio for his remarks and express my support for his remarks as well. Myself and other colleagues have been on the floor